Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia and right-hand man to King Wilhelm I of Prussia, was the dominant political force not only in Prussia and then Germany, but really all of Europe in the mid to late 19th century. He's probably the most important man you have never heard of in world history, especially in Western civilization and world affairs. And he was heavily involved with the unification of Germany, the formation of the German Empire, which was one of the most significant events of the second half of the 19th century. German unification, just like Italian unification, started economically and not politically. This is a map of what was known as the Zollverein, and forgive my poor German pronunciation. The Zollverein was a kind of economic union between many of the states of northern Germany that emerged in the 19th century as these states began to industrialize. It was essentially a free trade zone, and so they removed trade barriers, they produced common infrastructure, railroads and canals, etc., and they built up each other's, in so doing, built up each other's capacity for industrial development. And it's very important to note, you can see the years here, 1828 to 1854, that as we got into these years of the 19th century, it was Prussia and the German states, the northern German states, that were really industrializing very quickly and very successfully, and were coming to dominate European industrialization. They had moved ahead even of France, etc. And so this industrial unification, this economic unification, was an important first step in that direction, and the Zollverein was dominated by Prussia. And this industrialization produced a large and noisy, I would say, industrial middle class in Prussia and in the German states. They were very wealthy, and they were very liberal in their ideology, much like the industrial middle class in England. And they were a key, I guess, component or factor in the issues, people, ideas, etc. that Bismarck had to deal with. Now, Otto von Bismarck was not an industrialist, and he was not a liberal. A giant of politics, though, a very powerful man. Bismarck was a Junker. He was a Prussian aristocrat. He was incredibly wealthy. He controlled his landed estates. He had a great education. He had a great, I guess I would say, like the country aristocrat life, as you can think of that. That is who he was. And he was very conservative at his core. Now, Bismarck did not oppose industry, and he did not oppose industrial development. He understood that it was what was happening. He understood that it was good for Prussia. And so in that regard, he was very supportive of industrialization and Prussia's economic progress. But he was a conservative at heart, and but Bismarck is really associated with this movement that we call realpolitik, that we have talked about in class, the politics of realism. He was not an ideological diehard, if you will. He certainly was no Metternich, and he was not a fan of liberalism. He wasn't a John Stuart Mill. He really wasn't an ism guy at all. You know, we don't call realpolitik an ism. It doesn't have that attached. So the politics of reality, he was very astute. He understood the situation. He had a great understanding of people, of history, of politics. And I like to think of Bismarck as a guy who really kind of had his finger on the situation, if you will. He could kind of put his finger on it, especially when it came to foreign policy, and especially when it came to kind of understanding where most of the people stood. He was no great fan or supporters of these middle-class liberals who, even though Prussia remained an absolute monarchy in all practical for all practical purposes, due to the growing liberal sentiments, etc., even Prussia had adopted a legislature by the 1850s and a constitution, and so they had a parliament and a constitution, and their parliament was elected by universal male suffrage. And the industrial middle class liberals dominated this parliament, and Bismarck opposed them as often and as much as he could for one reason or another. And one of the things that Bismarck understood very well was that a lot of people, even though the liberals of the mid-19th century perhaps were the loudest, a lot of people at their heart remained quite conservative. He understood the power of nationalism. He himself wasn't prone to nationalism. He saw it as something of a distraction, but he understood the power of it, and he used it very effectively to his own ends. Bismarck had a long career in public service, and very importantly, he served early in his career as the ambassadors to both France and to Russia. So he was Prussia's ambassadors to both France and to Russia, and this is really important. It gave him a great sense of European politics and those two countries in particular. He was an excellent student of history, and so he just got it. He really, like I said, he understood history, he understood people, he understood politics very well. And in understanding politics, I guess I would say he really understood foreign policy. Bismarck was an outstanding statesman from a foreign policy aspect. He didn't do as well domestically, and we'll talk about that. He reached the height of his power as the chancellor for the King Wilhelm I. So when Wilhelm I became King of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck became his chancellor, and as such really exercised a great deal of power in Russia and a great deal of Prussia and a great deal of influence in Europe. One of the things that Bismarck first undertook, one of his first goals as the Chancellor of Prussia under King Wilhelm I, was to reorganize, reform, and modernize the Prussian army. If you'll think back to Unit 3 and we study in our study of absolutism, when we studied the formation of the Prussian state, we talked about the central place of the army in that, and Prussia had always been very proud of its army. It had always been very successfully militarily, but by the 19th century industrialization, they just kind of hadn't kept up with the changing times, and so kind of the marquee goal of the new king was to refit this army, and this was going to take quite a lot of money, and one of the things that the king wanted in this was required military service, that every young man would have to serve 2 or 3 years in the military. And so Bismarck went to the parliament and asked them for the money that they were going to need to take on this great reforming and reorganization of the Prussian army. And the very liberal dominated Prussian parliament said no, not because they didn't want a strong army. They liked the army very well, but they saw the army as being a vehicle through which the king could really continue to exercise his influence and authority. And while he was making this request to the parliament, Bismarck stated what really became one of his most prominent ideas, something with which he became very, very much associated. Germany does not look to Prussia's liberalism, and by Germany he means the Zollverein, the German states. Germany does not look to Prussia's liberalism, but to her power. Not by speeches and majorities will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the mistake of 1848 to 1849. Of course, he is referencing the uprisings and the revolutions that failed. That was the mistake of 1848 to 1849. But by iron and blood, not by speeches and majority will the great questions of the day be decided, but by iron and blood. Bismarck had no patience for isms. He's saying isms aren't going to decide anything. They aren't going to fix anything. Iron and blood. Industry, weaponry, military. None of those end in ISM. Those are the real sources of power. Machiavelli would be proud. I think that he would agree. Well, anyway, as pretty pragmatic as this statement is, the liberals, of course, rejected Bismarck's request. And Bismarck went on to raise the taxes necessary to carry out the reform and reorganization of the military on his own. And he pursued that policy without the blessing or assistance of Parliament. And the Parliament refused to act against him, though. They didn't rebel against him. And so this was really kind of the way for many years in Prussia that things went. There was this Parliament there, but they didn't really have any power. And if they disagreed with Bismarck and the king just kind of carried on doing what they wanted to do anyway. In 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, Metternich had set up this political entity called the German Confederation, and this had its own parliament. And because Metternich was a Habsburg and an Austrian, the parliament of the German Confederation was dominated by Austria. Now, just like he had a strong lack of patience for the liberals in the Prussian parliament, Bismarck had a lack of patience for the Austrians, and therefore the parliament of the Germanic Confederation, which was dominated by the Austrians. A lot of German nationalists had an issue with this too. Metternich in particular, and the Austrians in general, were really wary of nationalism. And nationalism was strong in Germany, and what German nationalism meant was unity. That's what they wanted to achieve. But the Austrians, because of the great diversity within their empire, they were weary of nationalism. And so they weren't really supportive of the ends of German unification. And indeed, the great question of the mid-19th century, following the exit of Metternich, was Großdeutsch or Kleindeutsch, and again, please forgive my bad German, Big Germany or Little Germany. And this was one of the great questions that had to be answered when it came to the question of German unification. Now, Bismarck didn't start out with a plan to say, I'm going to achieve German unification and here's how. But like I said, he really kind of had his finger on the pulse of things. He understood history, he understood people, he understood politics, and he understood that the force of nationalism was strong and that the German people were moving towards unification, that this was wanted. And so, like Cavour, he decided that it was in his interest, in the interest of Prussia, to control the process however they could, and he certainly looked for opportunities to do that. And so, coming to the question then of Big Germany or Little Germany, Big Germany meant all German-speaking people and states, and would have included the Habsburg lands, the old Habsburg lands, and Austria. Little Germany was Germany without Austria. And so one of the very early decisions that Bismarck made in terms of how it would be best for him to kind of control the process of German unification was that German unification had to mean Little Germany, Kleindeutsch, not Big Germany, all right, Germany without Austria. Bismarck was a great statesman, and we'll get into his conflict with Austria and his attempt to control the process of German unification, etc. here shortly. He was a great statesman, and his gift was foreign policy. His gift was foreign policy, and he understood that power on the foreign policy front came from iron and blood. It didn't come from isms and from ideas. And one of the primary efforts of Bismarck's early time in power was the reorganization of the Prussian army. And sure enough, that army was reorganized into a very modern, well-trained very efficient fighting force. But Bismarck also wasn't one to use his army like a bully or anything like that. He didn't have to be the big strong guy around go beating everybody up. But Bismarck was incredibly successful in his goals through diplomacy and through the use of warfare, which we are going to be talking about on Monday and next week. But because he was a great statesman and he was a really, really smart guy, and he wasn't somebody who was given to following his passions or anything, Bismarck had what I like to call his rules for war. And so these are Bismarck's rules for war according to Mrs. Chady. First rule, this is always the first rule and the most important rule: win. If you are going to go to war, you need to win the war. So Bismarck never went to war unless he knew he was going to win, or he at least had very good reason to suspect that he would. Number 2, diplomacy first. Diplomacy first, diplomacy first. You only fight when you have to, but you have a strong army, and you have a prepared army, and you're ready to win the wars in the event that diplomacy fails or will not work. Next, before you go to war, understand who is your friend and who is your enemy, and isolate your enemies. Bismarck was fantastically successful at isolating his enemies, using diplomacy to do that. In fact, ensuring before war broke out that no other powers were going to come to the aid of his enemy. Bismarck understood that it was too risky to take on a two-front war, or a war in which you're going to have to fight multiple foes, multiple opponents, because when you're doing either of those things, it makes it a lot harder to win. So isolate your enemies, only fight when you have to, have a really good army, and win the war. And finally, after you win, after you have met your goal, conclude a fair peace. To Bismarck, there was absolutely no sense in creating resentment by getting greedy after the fact. So you won. You win, but you don't gloat, is essentially what he is talking about here. You win, but you don't gloat. Be gracious in victory, because you don't want to create resentment or long-term enemies by rubbing anyone's face in it, if you will. And so we will see how Bismarck applied these rules and his great statesmanship in the unification of Germany.